The morning my brother tried to steal everything my father built, I was the one who held the door open for a stranger. I didn't scream when I found out what Marcus had done. I didn't throw things or cry in the parking lot. I had spent the last 3 years watching him quietly dismantle our father's legacy, and somewhere along the way I had learned that screaming was exactly what he wanted. It would make me look unstable, emotional, easy to dismiss. So, instead, I pressed my nails into my palm until the urge passed, and I drove to the mediation meeting with my hands perfectly steady on the wheel. Let me back up. My father, Robert, built Callaway Industrial Supply from a single warehouse in Dayton, Ohio, into a regional distribution company that employed 63 people at its peak. He was not a warm man in the traditional sense. He didn't coach my soccer teams or bake cookies, but he showed up. Every school play, every graduation, every time I called him from a parking lot because I couldn't stop crying and didn't know why. He showed up in the way that mattered. When he was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's 4 years ago, I moved back to Dayton. I reorganized my entire life around his schedule. I drove him to appointments, managed his medications, sat with him through the nights when the tremors were bad and he couldn't hold a glass of water by himself. Marcus, my older brother by 6 years, flew in twice, once for Christmas, once for the funeral. My father left the business to both of us equally. 50% each, spelled out clearly in a will that a very competent attorney named Patricia had drafted 2 years before his death. He also left a letter for each of us. Mine said he was proud of me. I keep it folded in my wallet. I don't know what Marcus's letter said because Marcus claimed it was private. But within 8 weeks of my father's death, Marcus had done 3 things that made me deeply suspicious. First, he transferred the operational bank account for Callaway Industrial Supply into an account where he was the sole signatory, citing an old business continuity clause in the partnership agreement that he claimed gave him executive authority during a transition period. Patricia, our father's attorney, told me she had never seen that clause before and had doubts about its origin. Second, he hired a new CFO, a man named Derek, who had previously worked for Marcus at his real estate firm in Charlotte. Third, he began invoicing the company for management consulting fees at a rate of $12,000 per month, retroactively. Backdated 7 months to before my father had even died. I flagged all of this. I sent emails. I requested documentation. I asked for the board minutes authorizing the consulting agreement. Marcus replied to exactly one of my messages, and the reply said, "You were always Dad's favorite. Don't make this ugly." I hired my own attorney. Her name was Renee, and she had the kind of voice that made you feel like everything was going to be fine even when nothing was. She filed for an emergency accounting audit and a temporary freeze on any further transfers. The mediation meeting had been scheduled for 3 months before we could get a date, and in that time, based on the partial records Renee managed to subpoena, Marcus had billed the company for a total of just over $340,000 in consulting fees. $340,000. From a company my father had built with 20 years of 6-day work weeks and a recurring back injury from loading trucks himself in the early days. That was the number I was sitting with when I pulled into the parking garage on East 3rd Street at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning in March. The garage elevator was out of service. There was a handwritten sign taped to the door, the kind that looks like it's been there for weeks. I took the stairs, and on the second-floor landing, I almost walked directly into an elderly man who was struggling with a cardboard box that was too wide for him to carry comfortably. He was in his mid-70s, I guessed, wearing a brown wool coat that had seen better decades and a pair of shoes that were carefully polished despite being visibly old. The box appeared to contain files. Paper files. The old kind, bundled with rubber bands and labeled in handwritten tabs. "Let me help you with that," I said, because my father raised me to say that, and also because standing in a parking garage stairwell watching a 70-year-old man struggle with a box while I did nothing was not something I was capable of. He looked at me with an expression of mild surprise, as if people did not often offer. "That's very kind," he said. "Just to the lobby." I took one side of the box. We made it down the remaining flight without conversation. In the lobby, he set his end down on a bench near the building directory and straightened slowly, pressing one hand briefly to his lower back. "Thank you," he said. "Where are you headed?" "Suite 400, I said. "Callaway Mediation." He looked at me for a moment. Something shifted behind his eyes, but his expression didn't change. "Busy morning for Suite 400, he said. "I'm going to Suite 412. I held the lobby door open and we walked to the elevator together. He didn't offer his name and I didn't ask. We rode up in the kind of comfortable silence that you sometimes have with strangers who don't feel the need to fill every space with noise. When the doors opened on the fourth floor, he nodded at me once, picked up the end of his box, and turned left. I turned right. I didn't think about him again for the next 2 hours. Suite 400 was a mediation firm called Harwick and Associates, and the conference room smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. Renee was already there. She stood when I came in and squeezed my arm once, which was her version of a pep talk. Marcus arrived 8 minutes late with Derek, the CFO, and an attorney I didn't recognize, a young man in a very expensive suit who introduced himself as Brandon and who had the confident energy of someone whose clients never lost. Marcus looked at me and smiled. The same smile he had given me at my father's wake when he told me that Dad had always believed in him more than he let on. The smile that never touched his eyes. The mediator, a woman named Carol, walked us through the ground rules. Both sides had submitted documentation packages. Today's session was for preliminary discussion, not final resolution. Everyone nodded. Brandon immediately asked to enter 3 additional exhibits that had not been in the original submission, which required a 15-minute recess while Renee reviewed them. I sat at the conference table and looked at the grain of the wood and did not think about screaming. The exhibits were what I had expected. A version of the consulting agreement with what appeared to be my father's signature, a board resolution authorizing the management transition clause, and a document appointing Marcus as interim CEO, all dated from approximately 8 months before my father died, during a period when his Parkinson's had progressed enough that his handwriting had changed significantly. I leaned toward Renee. His handwriting, I said quietly. I know, she said. I see it. Carol reconvened the session. Brandon began presenting the documents with the smooth confidence of someone reading from a script he had practiced. Marcus sat with his hands folded on the table, relaxed, performing the role of a patient businessman dealing with an unreasonable sibling. At one point, he glanced at me with an expression that I can only describe as pitying, as though I were a child who had wandered into an adult conversation. I had been in that chair before. Not literally, but emotionally. I had been in the chair of the person who everyone in the room treats as the problem, the oversensitive one, the one who should have just accepted what they were given. I had spent 3 years in that chair watching my brother bill our dead father's company for services that existed only on paper. I was very tired of that chair. Renee asked Brandon to explain the chain of custody for the 3 new documents. He said they had been located in a secondary storage unit belonging to the company, recently accessed during an inventory review. Renee asked when the inventory review had been conducted. Brandon said approximately 6 weeks ago. Renee asked why documents from that review were not submitted during the original discovery period. Brandon said the timeline was unfortunate, but the documents were genuine. Renee opened her folder. I'd like to enter an exhibit of my own, she said. I should explain how we got there. 6 weeks earlier, I had been going through my own files. Not company files, personal ones. My father had given me a portable hard drive 2 years before he died, one of those small black ones that fits in a shirt pocket, and told me it had the important stuff on it. I had plugged it in once after he gave it to me, seen a folder structure I didn't understand, and set it aside, meaning to look at it later. Later became 2 years. When Marcus's attorney submitted the initial documentation package, and I saw the 3 documents with my father's signature, something my father had said came back to me. He had told me, during one of those late nights when the tremors were bad and we would sit together watching old game shows because neither of us could sleep, that he had started keeping his own records. He said Marcus had been pressuring him for 2 years to restructure the business in ways that didn't make sense, and he had started noting everything down. Just in case, he said. You understand, Claire? Just in case. I found the hard drive at the bottom of a box in my closet. It took me 40 minutes to find the right folder. Inside it were 612 files. Voice memos, scanned documents, photographs of pages, and a running log that my father had maintained in a notes application, entry by entry, for 22 months. The oldest entry was dated April 14th. It read, Marcus brought the consulting agreement again. I told him I would not sign it. He said if I didn't formalize the arrangement, he would step back from the business entirely, and I'd have to manage the transition alone. I recorded our conversation. File, April 14, M, 4A. Every document Marcus had submitted, every signature, every board resolution. My father had kept a parallel record of each moment he had refused to sign them, each conversation where he had been pressured, and in several cases, audio recordings of those conversations made on his phone. The documents Brandon had submitted to mediation were forgeries, and my father had spent 22 months quietly, methodically, building the case that proved it. Renee entered the hard drive contents as Exhibit 14 through 19, with a summary prepared by a digital forensics firm she had retained 3 weeks earlier once I showed her what we had. The forensics report confirmed the metadata on the forged documents showed they had been created in a software version that did not exist until 14 months after their stated dates. The audio recordings, authenticated by voice analysis, contained my father clearly stating on 3 separate occasions that he had never authorized the consulting agreement and that he was being pressured by his son to sign documents he did not understand. The room got very quiet. Marcus looked at Exhibit 14 for a long time. Then he looked at Derek. Derek looked at the table. Brandon asked for a recess. Carol said we could take 15 minutes. Marcus stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not contempt, not the practiced pity he had worn all morning, but something that looked almost like fear. And then he walked out of the conference room, and I heard his voice in the hallway, low and urgent. And then I heard something I had not expected. I heard a second voice. I recognized it before I understood why. It took me a moment to place it, the careful, measured tone, the slight formality of the phrasing. The man from the stairwell, the brown coat, the box of paper files. I looked at Renee. She was already looking at the door. Carol returned first. Behind her came Brandon, whose confident energy had departed entirely. Behind Brandon came Marcus, who was no longer making eye contact with anyone. And behind Marcus came the man from the stairwell, without his coat now, in a dark suit jacket, carrying a single manila folder. Carol introduced him. His name was Gerald Whitmore. He was the regional director of the Ohio Division of Securities, 3 years from retirement, and he had been in Suite 412 that morning because his office had received a referral from a financial institution that had flagged unusual transfer activity on an account belonging to Callaway Industrial Supply. He had been intending to wait until the mediation produced documentation before approaching either party. He had not intended to become involved in today's session, but he had been in the hallway during the recess and had overheard enough, combined with what Brandon had apparently confirmed to him in a panicked 3-minute conversation, to determine that his involvement was now appropriate. He set the manila folder on the table and looked at Marcus with the specific expression of someone who has spent 30 years watching people make this exact mistake. "Mr. Callaway," he said, "I think we should talk about the $340,000. I want to tell you about something Marcus did that I have not mentioned yet. I didn't mention it earlier because I needed you to understand the full picture first. When my father died, he was cremated, as he had requested. His ashes were placed in a hand-thrown ceramic urn that I had made for him at a studio pottery class I took specifically for that purpose. I am not a potter. It took me 4 sessions, and it was not beautiful by any professional standard, but it was mine, and it was for him, and I had painted his initials on the bottom in the same blue he had used to paint the logo on his first delivery van. Marcus had the estate attorney transfer possession of all physical property in my father's home to the company as business assets pending the transition review, a maneuver that Renee told me was technically improper, but would take time to untangle legally. Among the items transferred was a wooden display shelf in my father's study where he kept things that mattered to him. A photograph of my mother, his first business license, framed, and the urn. When I went to retrieve personal items from the house 2 months after my father died, the shelf was empty. I asked Marcus where the urn was. He told me it had been in a box that was accidentally discarded during the estate cleanout. Accidentally discarded. I did not cry in front of him. I went to my car and I cried for 45 minutes, and then I drove home, and then I found the hard drive. People are not depreciating assets. My father told me that once, during those late-night game show sessions, when I asked him why he had never sold the building even when the offers were good, he said real estate was just land, and land was just dirt, but the people who had built something on it, that was the part that compounded. I didn't get the urn back. That chapter doesn't have a clean ending, and I want to be honest with you about that. Some things that are taken from you cannot be returned. But what I did get, what we got, was a full forensic accounting ordered by Gerald Whitmore's office, which uncovered not only the $340,000 consulting fraud, but a secondary scheme in which Marcus had been invoicing fictitious vendors through Derek's payroll access for an additional $200,000 over 18 months. The forged documents were referred to the county prosecutor. Brandon, the attorney, withdrew from representation before the end of the week. Derek accepted a cooperation agreement. Marcus was arrested on a Thursday morning. I know this because Renee called me and told me, and I was sitting at my kitchen table eating cereal, and I put the spoon down and I sat very still for a while. Carol concluded the mediation in a follow-up session 2 weeks later, with a partial agreement pending the criminal proceedings. The company assets were frozen. The 63 employees continued to receive their paychecks from a protected payroll account that Renee had managed to secure. I was appointed interim operating manager while the courts worked through the rest. I want to tell you what it felt like to walk back into that warehouse for the first time as the person in charge of it. It smelled like machine oil and cardboard and the specific dusty warmth of a building that has been running for 20 years. 3 of the warehouse supervisors had worked for my father since before I was born. One of them, a man named Phil, who had the kind of forearms you only get from 20 years of lifting, shook my hand when I came in and said, "Your dad would be glad you're here." I had to look at the ceiling for a moment. It's a useful direction to look when you don't want to cry in front of people. The whole case turned on a hard drive that sat in a closet for 2 years because I kept meaning to look at it later. I think about that sometimes. About all the things our parents try to give us that we set aside meaning to look at later. About how the thing that saves you is almost always something you almost threw away. Gerald Whitmore, it turned out, had been in that building for an entirely unrelated matter. Our paths crossed in a stairwell because an elevator was broken and because I was 20 minutes early, which I am always. Because my father told me that on time is late and early is on time, and he said it so many times that it rewired my brain permanently. Gerald told Renee later that he had noticed, in those 2 hours between the stairwell and the hallway outside the conference room, that I had held the lobby door, shared the elevator without complaint, and thanked the building receptionist by name after she checked me in. He said he decides early what kind of person he's dealing with. He said it matters in his line of work. I don't know exactly what was said in that hallway during the 15-minute recess, and I have chosen not to ask. Some moments are better left as the shape they leave, rather than the details that made them. What I know is that a man in a worn brown coat who polished his old shoes every morning had spent 30 years watching what happens when people think the rules don't apply to them. And he had been paying attention. Marcus had looked at me across that conference table with his hands folded, and his practiced patience, and his expensive attorney, and he had thought, she doesn't have anything. He forgot that I had paid attention too. I have my father's last voicemail saved on my phone. I have listened to it so many times I know it word for word. He called on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks before he died, and he said, "I want you to know, I documented everything. I didn't want to burden you with it while things were still uncertain, but I kept the records. I kept them for you. I love you, Claire. Don't let them tell you what things are worth. You already know." I played it in my car after Renee called me about the arrest. I sat in my driveway with the engine off and I listened to it twice. Then I went inside and I finished my cereal. And outside, in the early morning quiet of a Thursday in Dayton, Ohio, 63 people went to work at a warehouse that still had my father's name on the side of every truck. Because he built something that was worth keeping. And because, in the end, so did I.